Welcome back into our second half hour here on Introduction to Systematic Theology, where we're looking specifically at the idea, part number 2, Theology and Philosophy, and what we've been doing since the first half hour, which was analytical philosophy. Analytical philosophy and the impact it is having on theology in the life of many churches. So now we left off talking about pseudo propositions. That's where we left off the last time. Now, so I want to continue with that thought here because this is creeping in more and more and more. Even though these particular philosophies have been around for quite some time and they're more than 150 years old, yet they still remain alive and well in the life of a lot of pastors in their pulpits, as well as their congregational members who come to their churches. So I think that as we continue, we looked at this idea of what they call pseudo propositions, and this is where we had the kind of questions we left off with. The universe is actually mental rather than material, and we talked about this in our last session. Okay? Now, what I want to do is continue in this realm, and that's this one. It can be seen from this brief, albeit synopsis, that the logical positivists were imposing a standard or criterion on language. That's what they were doing. They didn't take language and analyze language as it's onto itself. They took concepts and imposed it on language. This is the reason why we get people who confuse descriptive text from prescriptive text. They do the exact same thing, and it comes from this analytical philosophical concept. Now, and so this led to a type of analysis termed as what they call ideal language philosophy. Ideal language philosophy. What in the world is that? Well, let me tell you about what this is. Ideal language philosophy, okay, is really contrasted with ordinary language philosophy. And from the period of time of 1910 to 1930, somewhere in that time period, analytical philosophers like Bertrand Russell, okay? More specifically, the Europeans and the Americans would more know about him than anybody else, okay? Ludwig Wittgenstein, okay? And so Wittgenstein, okay, he was another one, okay? And what they were doing is they were emphasizing this idea that's called creative, okay? It's creating an ideal language. And they were emphasizing that in terms of communication, okay? And they did it for the purposes of philosophical analysis. And the idea was that it would be free from ambiguity of ordinary language, and that, in their opinion, right, often made philosophy invalid. So they needed to kind of spruce this thing up. Okay? So during this phase, Bertrand Russell, okay, and Wittgenstein sought to understand language and hence philosophical problems by using formal logic. To formalize the way in which philosophical statements are being made. And so they come up with this idea. So this is what led to the idea of ideal language philosophy, which is to set up the language of science as the paradigm to which all languages would inform, had to conform to. Okay? So here was a prescribing, a telling of how language should operate. Okay? And what you don't understand is that this is really an imposition. They're imposing on language. This is the reason why we see, again, I repeat, we see people take prescriptive texts and they make them descriptive, and then we see people take descriptive texts and they make them prescriptive. Then you go, how does this happen? How do you come up with these interpretations? Okay, well, then there's a second phase of this, and in the second stage of what they call modern analytical philosophy, okay, the approach was quite different, right? And so rather than insisting that language must function in a particular way to be meaningful, now philosophy did something else. It said that it tries to describe how language actually does function. So then these philosophers, of the second stage, observed that ordinary language used by people in everyday conversation, as well as more technical forms of language. So now they come up with ordinary language philosophy. Now, which you got to be careful here, because in this particular paradigm, the philosophical methodology that sees the traditional philosophical problems, as rooted in misunderstanding philosophers, developed by distorting or forgetting what words actually mean in everyday use. So instead of insisting that all language must function in the same way in order to be meaningful, they asked about the different functions of language and the type of meaningfulness inherent in each one of these languages. So this approach is termed ordinary language philosophy or functional analysis. And the aim or the purpose is clarification. That's what I'm looking for. And it seeks to untangle all of the confusion, noting illogical and misuses of language. So now you go, Brother Eddie, what did you just say? What are you talking about? Well, this is how we get to all of these quote unquote modern day translations, of the Bible. And the problem is that it ignores the original use of the original languages. For example, if you were to take the Hebrew text, or you to take the Greek text, Hebrew from the Old Testament, the Greek text from the New Testament, and it just kind of bypasses that. And you're going to use what ordinary language is meaningful to the people right here in the here and now in our local communities. So once again, one of the unintentional consequences was, as philosophy just creeped into theology, was that it moved from the objectivity to the subjectivity. And that became a problem. I remember years ago, Dr. Gary Fleetwood and I were and I mention him a lot because we have traveled a lot together. And we've been in different places together. And we've been very, very good friends for many years now. But the thing that I found interesting was this: is that one time we're in Indonesia, and so Pastor Gary, Dr. Fleetwood, he's ministering, and he's talking about the heart, and the people had a hard time understanding the concept of the heart, because we know the heart as the essence, the center of man's being, right? Okay. And so besides it being a physical organ in the chest, and in among the Indonesian language and the tribes, they didn't have the word heart. In fact, their idea for heart was the throat. It was the throat. And as Dr. Fleetwood shares the story, and I don't remember all the nuances to it, but basically is that they're going to bury this woman because as far as they were concerned, she didn't have a heart. And the reason she didn't have a heart because she had a stroke and she was paralyzed. And in their language and in their way, what was meaningful use of their language was that the heart is in the throat. And since she had been paralyzed because of a stroke, she was being buried alive because she was considered to be dead. So now ask yourself a question here: if we come to this approach to language, well, no wonder we get the Word of God completely twisted. So from the perspective of theology, analytical philosophy is not a competitor in the sense of offering some alternative view of reality or values, or an opponent ruling out theology's right to speak. Rather, it's a facilitator. This is how it passed the muster. This is how it seemed to get by everybody. It was a facilitator, helping theologians to sharpen their use of words and to avoid misleading language, okay, analytical philosophy then can be an immediate and obvious benefit, okay, to theology, because Christianity has a primary objective of what? Of communication, right? It's of communication of its messages, and because the task of explicating, okay, the abstract concepts of theology is particularly difficult. Any help in using language is desirable. But the problem was that was the goal, but it didn't achieve it. It didn't achieve it. And so we have all kinds of versions of modern day language because it comes from this idea. Well, I'm not against that. The problem is that it moved away from it moved away from the original language and what it meant in its context. And so in the attempt to facilitate, okay, it winds up distorting much of what the word says in many occasions. Not all time, but that's what it does. So I think there's some serious problems, okay, with the analytical philosophy, okay? And let me look at this at least 4 areas with you, okay? Let's look at this at least in 4 areas, right? And that is because there are certain problems. Right? Number 1, rather than being merely descriptive, analytical philosophy tends to become prescriptive in very subtle ways. And this is a frustration. If you really know the context of the Word of God, it's a frustration. And you need to know that. Okay? So to be sure, its prescriptiveness is not categorical. Okay? You must use language this way. No, it doesn't say that. But it is highly suggestive. Okay? If you wish to avoid confusion, do not use language in the following way. You see that? You see the suggestive idea? Okay? Yet even the criteria of what is confusion and what is clarity are based on presuppositions. It's based on presuppositions. Okay? And at times this tends to be overlooked. Okay? You know, many, many years ago, and I remember this. This is in the early 1960s. Okay? And one of the Kennedy brothers, okay, was running for president, okay, and of the United States. And one of the unique things about him was that he loved to read Greek history, Greek philosophy, and he loved to read Shakespeare, okay, and what he did was that when he would go out into the neighborhoods, okay, and when he would go into the neighborhoods where the least educated people were, okay, and he would go into the minority communities, but he would quote the Greek scholars and the classics. And and people say, well, you can't do that. You have to talk to people at their level. At the level of the ghetto. You got to talk to them right here. You have to talk to them at this level where they understand. But he refused. And what he did was that Robert Kennedy, who was running for president, he would quote the Greek classics. And what it did was that it perked the interest of a lot of people who said, what is that? But he quoted it in such a way it made so much sense in the original context, because he was able to take the original context of those quotes, okay, and explain them in a way that they understood, and yet still be faithful to the original quote. Okay? Well, that's what we have to do in the scriptures. Okay? Now, the second other issue about analytical philosophy is that sometimes it appears to draw what I would say two sharp distinctions between different types of languages. It's almost arbitrary, right? Because, well, who's the arbiter of how it should be done? Look, some language, particularly, if you think about this with me, okay, particularly theological language, okay, may participate in several different functions simultaneously, okay? For example, let's take a statement. Let's take a statement like this, such as, Jesus Christ is the risen Lord of the church. Jesus Christ is the risen Lord of the church. Just take that statement, okay? may simultaneously have historical significance. It may have metaphysical significance. It may have ethical significance. And it may have expressive functions. So when you draw a line that's just too sharp in distinction, okay, you may exclude the other areas. Okay? Now remember in the Bible that you have this. In the Bible, remember that every single verse has a very specific interpretation. There's only one interpretation. But we may have multiple applications. Well, the problem is that analytical philosophy does not allow us to do that. Okay? It says one and it excludes the others. Then the third area about analytical philosophy, okay, is that it's not truly neutral. It's not a neutral tool because it imposes some things on it, okay? And let's be honest, because it doesn't always guard against naturalistic assumptions, particularly with respect to its conception of the nature of language. It should not preclude language having supra-empirical reference. No. Then there are areas in which we cannot be content with descriptive and non-prescriptive treatments. And analytical philosophy really messes this up completely, okay? It blurs the lines, or it just kind of eliminates them completely, okay? And this is particularly true with regard to ethics, okay? If philosophy does not contribute to some normative way to drawing conclusion in this area, okay? To draw some conclusions, okay? That I think that everybody can accept, okay? So if philosophy will not contribute to this, okay? Then what discipline will? Think about that. So in more recent years, philosophy, in order to justify its existence, you know what's doing? It's beginning to move. It's beginning to move toward making a greater number of normative judgments. That's what it's beginning to do. Contemporary society cannot afford the luxury of just mere description and analysis. It just can't. And even analytical philosophers have had to change to avoid being left out of the ferment of the modern sense, okay, of the modern scene completely. So, because they can see their own shortcomings. They can clearly see this. So I want you to understand it. And this is creeping in. It is creeping in. And still, and this is the reason why, Dr. Fleetwood and I, one of the things that bugs us is that we don't use biblical language anymore. We don't use Bible words. They're just offensive to people. So we create other terms. We say other words, and the problem is that when you change a word, it's just not exchanging one word for another. That's not what you're doing. And this is, I think, where analytical philosophy fell. And so we're not exchanging one word for another word, okay? What's happened is that we're exchanging concepts. When you exchange terminology, it's not just the words. You're exchanging the concepts. And this is where analytical philosophy, I believe, that's my personal belief, has really done a disservice, a great disservice, to the pulpit, to the preachers who've adopted this kind of thinking into their theological paradigm when they go to teach and preach the Word of God. Now, let's go on and look at now the next one. It's called process philosophy. Process philosophy. Process, process philosophy. I want you to see this with me. There has been a long debate, over whether reality changes or is basically fixed in character. Did you want to? The big debate: does reality change, or is it fixed in character? Okay. Now, Heraclitus, he maintained that change is of the very essence of reality, whereas Parmenius, emphasized fixity. Okay? And so you go, well, who's Heraclitus? Well, Heraclitus, he was this ancient Greek, pre-Socratic Ionian philosopher. Okay, you go, what is that? Okay, and he was of Ephesus. Okay, and he was a native of the city of Ephesus in what we call modern day Turkey today. Okay, and then part of the Persian Empire, right? And he would say things like this. Okay, there is nothing permanent except change. Everything that changes the same stays the same. Okay, you cannot step twice into the same rivers. Okay, for other waters are ever flowing onto you. He would say things like this: no man ever steps in the same river twice, for it is not the same river, and he's not the same man. All is flux. Nothing stays still. Nothing endures, but changes. Much learning does not teach understanding. Change alone is unchanging. Okay? So he would say things like this. And eventually, and what he did was that this is where a lot of modern day preachers began to take the paradoxes that you find, and there's a lot of them in the Bible, okay, and began to twist them and turn them slowly based on this kind of philosophy, which, by the way, has been in the educational systems in the Western world for a long, long time. And eventually it has been exported out of the Western world, and it has consumed and set like a fire in Asia, okay, in the continent of Africa, and now has been translated and slipped into Latin America, okay? And so we know that it's been around in the Americas, in the North America, okay, and in Europe for a long, long time. So process philosophy has these two perspectives, that things are always changing and no, the other one is fixed. Now, I mentioned another name to you, and that is Parmenius. And Parmenius, okay, he was from Elea, and he was this pre-Socratic Greek philosopher also, but he was from Elea, which is in Magna Graecia, okay, and this is Greece, okay, and he thought that to have been, and his thought is that to have been in his prime around 475 years before Christ. So you can see this influence has been around a long time. Okay? And Parmenius has been considered the founder of metaphysics or ontology. Okay? ontology. Okay? And has influenced a whole history of Western philosophy. Okay? So these are the two competing positions in what they call process philosophy. Okay? Most philosophers, okay, have recognized both change and permanence, okay, within the world. Okay? So those who hold to what they call the substantialist view, okay, have emphasized that the fixed states, this is fixed, okay, regarding the changes as merely necessary transitions between them. Okay? And then we have other guys, okay, such as Alfred North Whitehead. Alfred North Whitehead, that see changes, okay, themselves as the key to understanding reality. Okay? Whitehead is the father of what we call modern process thought. That's who this guy is, okay? And although later philosophers and theologians such as Charles Hartshorne, okay, J.B. Cobb Jr., okay, is another one. Norman Pittinger, okay, is another one. Have given it greater visibility, and these were all people that we had to study back in the 70s in college. And I remember in our philosophy classes we had to study these guys. And yet these guys have had an impact in theology. Well, why is that? Well, because for a lot of seminaries and Bible schools, okay, philosophy were required courses that they had to take, okay, because it helped you to communicate theology. the problem is that then it was no longer a tool of aid to help you communicate. They became disciplines unto themselves. Okay? So unlike the three other philosophies that we've sketched so far, we looked at process. Process philosophy, okay, is, I would say, avowedly metaphysical. Okay? Definitively metaphysical. Okay, while aware of the impatience of many of the modern philosophers with metaphysics, okay, the process thinkers feel that their type of metaphysics is not vulnerable to attack, as for example, as those who are existentialists, existential philosophy, substantialists, okay, or idealistic views. So you need to understand that, okay? So I want you to see this with me, because we get to some other ones here. The central conviction, if I can use it, if I can put it in those terms, okay? Here is that change is the key to understanding of reality. Change is the key to understanding reality. Okay? In fact, that change is reality. Okay? So the world is not basically made up of substances that change from one to another. Rather, it's made up of dynamic processes. Okay? We're to be concerned not so much with the things as with the events. Okay? And so this is a philosophy of life, how you look at things. And this crept in also into the theological circles. So the divine reality participates in the reality of all else. And now we begin to see how they bring God into this picture, or this philosophical position, or comes into theology. Okay, and that is that divine reality participates in the reality of all else. Consequently, it or he, okay, is not static, unmoved, mover, or changeless essence. No. He is active. He is creative. Okay? Or it is living, and it is creative, and it is active. So this observation of kind of philosophy underscores one of the basic tenets of process thought reality, which is basically one type. There is no dualism. Okay? There is no dualism. Okay? Whether it's of material or spiritual, nature, supernature, phenomenon, okay, noumena, which is spirit, okay, or changing and unchanging. What is true of the whole reality is consequently true of each part of it. So the characteristics of God, okay, are those of the rest of the reality in general. Well, Whitehead, remember what I mentioned to him earlier, Whitehead? Well, Whitehead thinks of the basic units of reality not as bits of matter, but as of moments of experience. Moments of experience. And he thinks, okay, so a moment of experience is always someone experiencing something. Okay? So this is where we get a lot of people who really took this philosophical position, okay, and kind of failed to connect all the dots. And this is where experience is more than truth. Okay? So your experience trumps or overrides, okay, supersedes, okay, the Word of God. And we can see this in all kinds of modern day churches that we have today. Okay? So you need to understand that. So a moment of experience is always someone experiencing something. Well, that's pretty deep, right? He says, so each of these occasions of experience, or actually occasions, has two poles. You know what I said? Two poles. There are two poles, okay? And it's called, first one's called the mental pole, okay? And it grasps the eternal objects, okay? Which are pure possibilities for realization, okay? Apart from any actual concrete instance of them. And this includes forms, quantities, okay, relations. So the physical pole grasps, assess data, and other occasions. So we have a mental pole and we have a physical pole. Okay, so everything is about what you're experiencing. And you need to grasp this idea, okay? And so this is creeped into the church, why people are more interested in experiences, okay, than they are in objective truth, which is the reason why a lot of so-called modern day healing crusades, okay, are built on this kind of analytical, on this kind of process philosophy. We'll pick this up in our next session.